Hello lovers. Eleanor here. Tonight, we will embark on a journey that begins in the quiet shadows of my own kitchen, and then carries us back to a dinner party that, believe it or not, helped spark the Cold War's very first sparring. I can see it now, as if I've set the table for it myself. The gleam of silver under the lamplight, the soft rustle of linen, the scent of something rich simmering in a pot. There's a bottle of red wine breathing on the counter, its bouquet rising in slow spirals. And it catches me off guard. The aroma carries me away, far from this small, silent apartment. If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And to share with me your favorite historical story. It warms my heart to hear them. Now, settle in comfortably. Close your eyes. And let's travel back in time with Eleanor. It's just me here tonight. A single chair pulled out at the table. The others pushed in neatly as if waiting for company that will never arrive. My winter coat still hangs by the door, a dusting of frost on the shoulders from my evening walk. I thought I'd keep busy. Slice some bread. Pour a little wine. But when the knife hits the cutting board, the sound seems to echo back at me, reminding me how empty the place feels. I'm not afraid of solitude. Oh no. I've grown used to it. But every now and then, a memory will push through, like a photograph sliding out of an old album. Sometimes, it's the memory of Robert, my late husband, sitting across from me. Other times, it's something more unexpected. A flash of laughter from a long-ago conversation. The clink of a glass. The curve of a smile from someone I haven't thought about in decades. And tonight, with the smell of wine filling the room, I'm reminded of a dinner table much grander than mine. The year was 1934. The place, Cambridge, England. It was the kind of dinner that drew in the young, the bright, the ambitious. Some wore their confidence like fine tailoring. Others had that restless, searching look in their eyes. As if the world, vast as it was, still wasn't big enough for them. I wasn't there, of course. But over the years, I've read the accounts, studied the photographs, even walked the cobbled streets myself. The picture I've pieced together is vivid. A wood-paneled hall flickering with candlelight. The air warm with the mingling scents of roast lamb and tobacco smoke. There was a hum of conversation. The kind that shifts and tightens in tone when certain topics are broached. Politics, for example. Empire. The rise of fascism in Europe. And somewhere, in that undercurrent, the first invisible thread of betrayal was quietly being spun. Now, here's the shocking part. And it still catches me when I say it out loud. This seemingly harmless dinner gathering planted the seed for what would become the Cambridge Five. A spy ring that leaked British secrets to the Soviet Union for decades. And it began, so gently. A few shared ideas. A toast to a better world. A private conversation in a corner. Perhaps sparked by a wry comment over the soup course. When I think of that, I can't help but wonder. How often do the world's great turning points hide inside moments that feel ordinary? Do we ever know, at the time, that we're sitting in the room where history is shifting under our feet? I imagine those young men, laughing between sips of wine, having no idea, or perhaps every idea, that they were standing at the mouth of a tunnel they'd spend the rest of their lives walking through. And here in my kitchen, with the shadows creeping in along the walls, I lift my glass, take a small sip, and feel the past settle in beside me. Like an uninvited but not unwelcome guest. The snow was falling outside my window earlier this evening. The kind of soft, unhurried snow that seems to hush the whole world. I sat there for a long while, watching the flakes spin and drift, and thought about how easily silence can hide 1,000 little movements. It's the same with history. What we call events are often just the visible tip. Beneath, there's a deep current of quiet exchanges, chance encounters, whispered promises. That dinner party in 1934 was one such current. At the head of the table sat a man who would later be known to the world as Kim Philby. Though that night, he was just Harold. Handsome, sharply dressed, with a smile that could disarm even the sternest of dons. He was charming. Yes. But it wasn't the hollow charm of a social climber. It was something warmer, more personal. He knew how to listen. That, I think, is how he found his way into the trust of others. Philby wasn't alone. Among the guests were Guy Burgess, flamboyant and unpredictable, with a wit so quick it could cut. Donald MacLean, quieter, brooding almost, yet with eyes that missed nothing. And Anthony Blunt, the art historian, who carried himself with the poised grace of someone who knew the value of subtlety. They were young. Too young, perhaps, to understand the full weight of their convictions. But the world they inhabited was already pressing its urgency into their bones. The Great Depression had left deep scars on Britain, and the shadow of Hitler's rise was lengthening across Europe. In the parlors and coffee houses of Cambridge, talk of fascism and communism wasn't just theoretical. It felt like a matter of survival. These young men weren't alone in their sympathies toward the Soviet Union. Many saw it as the only bulwark against the spreading tide of fascism. And so, the conversations at that dinner weren't entirely unusual for the time. What was unusual was what would grow from them. Somewhere between the roast lamb and the after-dinner port, there came an introduction. A guest whose name wasn't recorded in the formal accounts. A man who spoke softly, with a trace of a foreign accent, and whose eyes lingered just a fraction too long when he looked at you. His presence didn't cause a ripple in the room. But years later, those who were there would realize he'd been the first link in a chain that would bind them to Moscow. I've often wondered about that moment. Did Philby feel a flicker of recognition? That this was no ordinary acquaintance? Or did he simply enjoy the conversation, unaware of where it would lead? I suppose that's the trouble with moments like these. They can only be seen clearly in hindsight. And by then, they're as fixed as insects in amber. You see, this is the part of history that troubles me. Even now. We like to imagine that betrayal happens in dark alleys, with a hood pulled low and a whispered password. But in truth, it often begins in the glow of candlelight, over a second glass of wine, when ideals are high and the future feels pliable. And it's here, alone in my kitchen, that I find the thought both chilling and oddly human. We're all vulnerable to the warmth of a shared vision, the belief that we're part of something bigger. Sometimes, that something is noble. Other times, it's a net we never meant to swim into. I lean back in my chair and glance at the empty seat across from me. I imagine Philby there, telling me his version of that night. His hands gesturing lightly as he describes the crackle of the fire, the laughter around the table, the moment a stranger's words began to align with his own convictions. Would he admit to knowing? Or would he tell me it was all just a happy accident of conversation? The snow outside thickens, blurring the street lamps into soft halos. And I can't help but think, if a dinner party could spark one of the most infamous spirings in history, what small moments might be unfolding somewhere tonight, unnoticed. waiting for their turn to be called history. The kettle hissed on the stove, its thin plume of steam curling like a question mark against the dim kitchen light. I poured the water slowly over the tea leaves, watching them swirl and darken the cup, and found myself thinking of how certain moments in life seem so ordinary at the time, yet they mark the quiet turning of the tide. For Philby and his friends, that dinner was only the first step. What followed was a gradual weaving of threads, one meeting at a time, into a net so intricate they would scarcely notice they were caught in it until years had passed. It began with books, pamphlets, and coffee house debates. Cambridge in the mid-1930s was fertile ground for political thought. Idealism hung in the air like the scent of rain. The British establishment, with its stiff collars and stiff opinions, seemed hopelessly out of touch to young men who saw Europe sliding toward catastrophe. The Soviets, at least in theory, promised an unyielding stand against fascism. That theory was intoxicating. And in the hands of a skilled recruiter, intoxication could become loyalty. The recruiter, as later pieced together by historians, went by the name of Otto. He wasn't a large man, nor particularly imposing, but he had the patience of a watchmaker. He knew the right questions to ask, the kind that made a young man feel clever, important, chosen. He attended art lectures, political rallies, even cricket matches. Not because he cared for any of them, but because he cared about who else might be there. Otto didn't push. He nudged. An invitation for a walk. A shared newspaper clipping. A conversation that lingered just a little too long on the failures of British foreign policy. Philby, Burgess, Maclean, and Blunt. Each was approached in his own way. Philby was drawn in through political discussion. Burgess through his social circles and his knack for knowing everyone worth knowing. Maclean through his deep interest in diplomacy. And Blunt, perhaps the most complex of the four, through art and the quiet suggestion that art, too, was political. Sometimes I think about the vulnerability of youth. The way ideals burn brighter when the heart is still untested. I remember myself at that age, though my battlefield was only the classroom. The certainty with which I argued over historical interpretations. I would have been easy prey for someone who seemed to share my convictions, who told me that I could be part of something grander than lectures and essays. It's almost comforting to imagine them as hardened agents from the start. But the truth is far more mundane and therefore more unsettling. They were not spies yet. They were simply young men saying yes to one more conversation, one more meeting, one more little task that seemed harmless enough. And then, before they knew it, they were in too deep. I picture Philby walking across the damp cobblestones of Cambridge after one of those meetings, his breath misting in the cold air. Perhaps he felt a thrill of purpose, or perhaps a pang of uncertainty. We'll never know, because such thoughts rarely leave a written trace. History often forces us to read between the lines. And in the spaces between those lines, I see a young man who thought he was bending the rules for a better future, never realizing the rules would one day belong entirely to someone else. I've kept a small photograph of my late husband in the same drawer where I keep my tea. Sometimes, when I take it out, I remember our own early days. Two idealists sitting on a park bench, believing we could change the world. It's a dangerous kind of beauty. That sort of hope. And it makes me wonder. When does hope become the first step toward compromise? The tea has gone cold in my cup. Outside, the snow is thinner now, flakes spinning lazily in the street light. Somewhere in the distance, A car passes, its tires whispering over wet pavement. And here, in this quiet room, I can almost hear the murmurs of a Cambridge cafe 80 years ago, where four young men sat at separate tables, each on the verge of saying yes to the same hidden hand. The memory of that Cambridge cafe stayed with me as I turned to the next chapter in their story. Those moments when the yes they had whispered in youth began to bear consequences. You see, it wasn't just idle talk anymore. By the late 1930s, Europe was teetering on the brink of war, and the Soviets had moved from polite interest to pointed requests. The first assignments were laughably small. Write down a conversation overheard at a party. Report on a speech given by a visiting politician. Photograph a page from a library archive that was too sensitive to circulate. Easy enough to justify, especially to themselves. It's not spying, they might have said. It's sharing ideas. But sharing ideas soon meant sharing documents. And sharing documents meant breaking the law. Burgess, with his disarming charm, became the social spider of the group. He had a knack for slipping into rooms where he technically didn't belong, collecting gossip and half-truths that, when stitched together, formed an uncomfortable picture of British policy. Maclean, destined for the diplomatic service, was fed questions to raise at embassy luncheons. His answers carried back to Moscow in the quiet folds of a courier's coat. And Philby. Philby proved himself especially useful. His gift was patience. He cultivated contacts with a gardener's care, trimming a weight out, watering ambition, waiting for trust to bloom. By the time war broke out, his network within the British establishment was like a vine woven through stone. It could not be untangled without tearing at the wall itself. I paused to look out the window of my little sitting room. The street was empty now. The snow pressed into dull gray slush by passing boots. Somewhere, a window shutter banged in the wind. Loneliness has a way of making every sound feel like it belongs to you. As if the world is calling your name but has forgotten why. It's strange. I often feel closer to these historical figures than to the people I pass in the supermarket. Perhaps it's because their flaws are laid bare. Their choices preserved like insects in amber. In them, I see the same tangled threads that run through all our lives. Ambition, loyalty, self-deception, the ache to belong to something greater than ourselves. There's a story, half rumor, half documented fact, about one particular meeting. It took place in a cramped London flat in 1940. The blackout curtains drawn tight. Burgess arrived first, reeking faintly of gin, his scarf flecked with melting snow. Philby came next, his overcoat buttoned to the throat, carrying a battered briefcase. The third man, never officially named, was already at the table. A map of Europe spread before him like an open wound. On that night, they were asked for something far more dangerous than gossip. The names of sympathizers within the British government. People who could be counted on to influence policy in ways favorable to the Soviets. The request hung in the air like the smell of wet wool. Someone, perhaps Burgess, laughed nervously. But the names came, one by one, written on a scrap of paper that was burned in an ashtray minutes later. When I first read about that meeting, I felt a strange pang. Not of sympathy, exactly, but of recognition. How many times in my own life have I crossed a small line without noticing, only to find later that the line was not small at all? I thought of my late husband again. Of the dinner party where I overheard something I should never have heard. I never told him. Never told anyone. but it colored the way I saw certain friends from then on. Secrets are corrosive. They eat at the edges of trust until the whole thing crumbles in your hands. And so the spy ring, though they wouldn't have called it that, tightened its grip. These young men were no longer just dabbling in dangerous ideas. They were instruments now, playing notes in a symphony they could not hear in full. The conductor was far away. And the music was about to grow louder. The war had a way of accelerating everything. Loyalties, fears, ambitions. When Britain found itself in the thick of the fight, the Cambridge men stepped fully into their double lives. What had once been an intellectual game now became a profession. And a perilous one at that. Philby, ever patient, had maneuvered himself into the heart of British intelligence. He was meticulous, with a cool head that masked the current of urgency running beneath. The Soviets trusted him implicitly, and his handlers admired the precision with which he delivered information. It wasn't just the content. It was the context. A single file meant little without the quiet whispers that explained its weight. Burgess was chaos incarnate, yet somehow indispensable. He knew everyone. Politicians, broadcasters, diplomats. And his friendships were messy but fruitful. You'd find him at a dinner party in Chelsea one night, passing a folded slip of paper under the table. And the next evening drinking brandy with a cabinet secretary, coaxing out just one more indiscreet detail. Maclean's path was perhaps the most dangerous. Stationed in the United States as part of the British Embassy, he had access to the conversations shaping the Allied war effort. Washington in those days was a hotbed of optimism and paranoia. A place where the right question over lunch could yield an answer worth more than gold to a foreign power. And Maclean, with his careful manner and earnest eyes, was a master of asking the right questions. The risk was monumental. Every handoff of information, every clandestine meeting was a roll of the dice. Yet, somehow, they thrived. They thrived because Britain's intelligence services were focused outward, on the threat of Nazi Germany, never suspecting that the rot might be growing in their own house. One winter evening in 1942, in a dim office lit by the glow of a desk lamp, Philby reviewed a file marked Top Secret. It contained details of British operations in North Africa, including troop movements and supply routes. The kind of information that, in the wrong hands, could change the shape of battles. Later that night, the file, or at least its contents, would be in Soviet possession. I imagined him closing the folder with care, placing it back in its drawer, and locking it. Everything in its place, as if nothing had been touched. Sometimes, when I read these accounts, I find myself wondering, did they sleep well at night? Did they believe so deeply in their cause that guilt never troubled them? Or did the faces of dead soldiers flicker through their dreams? I thought about my own sleepless nights. Nights when the house seemed too large, the ticking of the clock too loud, and the weight of solitude pressed down like a blanket I couldn't throw off. Perhaps, in their way, they too lay awake. But for them, the fear was not of being alone, it was of being found out. The war years were full of moments where history turned quietly, with no fanfare, no great speeches. Just the passing of a manila envelope, or the exchange of a nod between two strangers at a train station. In those moments, the Cambridge ring fed the Soviet Union information that would shape strategy on the Eastern Front, saving countless Soviet lives while perhaps costing others elsewhere. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. History is rarely clean. For every life saved, another may be lost. For every moral victory, A shadow of compromise lingers. I often think about how we, as a species, tolerate such trade-offs. Sometimes even celebrate them when they serve our chosen side. By the time the war began to tilt in the Allies' favor, the ring was deeply entrenched. They had survived not just by cunning, but by the perfect camouflage of belonging. They were insiders, fluent in the language of the establishment, wearing the same suits, drinking from the same crystal glasses, shaking the same hands. But even as victory approached, the seeds of the next conflict were sprouting. The Cold War was coming. And with it, a world where shadows would be longer, alliances more brittle, and trust even harder to find. And for the Cambridge spies, their greatest challenge, and their greatest betrayal, was still ahead. Peace, when it came in 1945, was like a heavy curtain falling after a fevered performance. The lights dimmed. The stage hushed. But behind the velvet, the actors still whispered their lines. For Britain, the war was over. But a new script was already being written. A script of suspicion, invisible battle lines, and secrets traded in quiet corridors. The Americans called it the Cold War long before most in London understood what that meant. The enemy was no longer the jackboot and the swastika, but the hammer and sickle. And in this new theater, the Cambridge ring was perfectly placed. Philby, smooth as polished marble, found himself rewarded for wartime service with a senior post in the newly formed Section 9, tasked with countering Soviet intelligence. Imagine it. The fox-appointed guardian of the henhouse. I picture him in those offices at Broadway buildings. The scent of pipe smoke hanging in the air. His desk tidy. His files in order. Yet every so often, a document would vanish not in sight, but in meaning. Spirited away in his mind to be handed over later. Maclean, with his calm, unassuming demeanor, was sent to Washington, where he served as the British Embassy's liaison on American foreign policy. It was a role that allowed him to breathe in the warm air of post-war optimism, and to exhale it, reshaped, into Moscow's eager ear. The Soviets valued him immensely. He wasn't just delivering papers. He was delivering the pulse of America's intentions. Burgess, ever the charming disaster, stumbled upward into a position at the Foreign Office. His flat in Mayfair became a revolving door for journalists, MPs, and civil servants. People who would loosen their tongues over whiskey, never suspecting the grinning man across from them was fishing for more than gossip. By then, the Soviet Union had its fingers deep in British affairs. And much of that reach traced back to these men who had once clinked glasses in a Cambridge drawing room. What strikes me most, looking back, is not their boldness but the sheer ease with which they moved. You see, the British establishment had a fatal flaw. It believed in its own. If you spoke the right way, dressed the right way, and had the right school tie, suspicion glanced off you like rain off a waxed coat. Philby and his friends wore that armor effortlessly. One evening in early 1946, Philby hosted a small dinner party at his London home. His wife poured the wine. Conversation flowed. And somewhere between the roast lamb and the treacle tart, an offhand remark about an upcoming operation in Eastern Europe was made by a guest. A flicker in Philby's eye. A mental note taken. And by morning, that scrap of information would join a bundle of others making their way to the Soviet embassy. I often wonder what that guest would have felt, had they known. Would they have recalled the clink of glasses with shame? Or would they have simply dismissed it? Oh, Philby would never, in my own life, Trust has been both a bomb and a bruise. I have trusted the wrong people. And I have been trusted when perhaps I should not have been. Age teaches you that betrayal rarely comes from the stranger at the door. It comes from the familiar voice in your kitchen. The friend who knows where you keep the spare key. The late 1940s were a season of quiet, treacherous blossoming for the Cambridge Ring. The war had given them a reason. Peace gave them opportunity. Files crossed their desks. Cables passed through their hands. And each piece of paper was a choice. Keep it for Britain. Or share it with Moscow. Again and again. They chose Moscow. And each choice was a step deeper into the shadows, where one's own reflection becomes hard to recognize. They didn't know it yet. But every careful handoff, every coded message, was drawing the circle tighter. In the years to come, that circle would close. By the early 1950s, the whispers had begun. Not loud enough to be called accusations. Not yet. But murmurs in hallways. Exchanged glances in smoky clubs. The uneasy awareness that something in the machinery was off. Files were going missing. Operations in Eastern Europe, meticulously planned, were collapsing before they even began. Agents vanished. Swallowed, it seemed, by the Iron Curtain before they had had time to send a first report. For Philby, McLean, and Burgess, this was the most dangerous phase. Not because they were less secure, but because the net was finally being woven. The Americans, who had grown suspicious after a string of inexplicable failures, were pressing their British counterparts for answers. And in the background, the FBI's patient, methodical investigations were beginning to turn up names. McLean, always the steady one, had grown more strained. Years of double life had taken their toll. There were rumors of heavy drinking, of unpredictable moods. His friends chalked it up to overwork. They didn't see the private fear gnawing at him. That the Americans were getting closer. And his time was running out. Burgess, meanwhile, was spiraling. His charm was still there. But it had become ragged. Brittle. He drank too much. Spoke too freely. And more than once found himself on the edge of trouble. Always saved. Somehow. By friends in high places. It's the great paradox of British society at the time. The same old boy network that allowed these men to rise was now shielding them from the consequences of their treachery. And Philby? Philby was unshaken. Or at least, he wore the mask of unshakable calm. He knew suspicion was in the air. He could taste it. But he trusted his skill, his position, and the simple fact that those around him wanted to believe in his innocence. I imagine him standing at his office window, cigarette in hand, looking out over the grey sprawl of London, knowing full well the Americans were beginning to doubt him. He would have thought, if I just keep my footing, I can ride this out. In 1951, everything changed. A codebreaker at GCHQ had been slowly piecing together fragments from intercepted Soviet communications. Among the lines of numbers and ciphers, a profile emerged. An unnamed British diplomat, perfectly fitting Donald McLean. The realization spread through the upper echelons of MI5 and MI6 like a slow poison. One of their own was working for Moscow. The problem was how to act without tipping him off. But the Cambridge Ring was too tightly knit for that to be possible. Philby learned of the impending move against McLean and quietly passed the warning through Burgess. It was meant to be discreet. But Burgess, reckless, impulsive Burgess, made a choice that stunned everyone. He fled with McLean, both men vanishing almost overnight. I remember the newspaper headlines. British diplomat's defect to Russia. It was a national embarrassment. A breach so deep it felt like the ground shifting beneath our feet. The public was told little, of course. But the truth, hidden in closed-door meetings and locked files, was even more damning. I think often about that decision to run. It was the point of no return. For McLean, it was survival. For Burgess, perhaps it was instinct. Or perhaps he simply couldn't bear to face the music alone. In those hours before they slipped away to the Channel ferry, did they glance back at London? Did they think of the lives they'd touched? The friends they'd left behind? Betrayal is rarely clean. It leaves behind scraps, unpaid bills, half-finished letters, photographs in drawers. And it leaves behind questions that never quite settle. Philby, of course, stayed. And that was his genius. He survived the scandal. Even turned it to his advantage. Others would fall under suspicion. But not him. Not yet. As for me, I've known the ache of people disappearing. Not into Moscow, but into silence. Friendships that seemed solid one year and were gone the next, leaving only the echo of conversations past. It's a kind of defection, too. Only without the headlines. In the corridors of power, the flight of Burgess and McLean sent a chill through the British establishment. The Americans were furious. Trust between allies frayed. And the hunt for the remaining moles began in earnest. The circle was tightening. But Philby still stood in the middle of it, smiling. And that smile, more than anything, was what kept him safe. By the mid-1950s, London had grown colder. Not just in its weather, but in its spirit. The war had been over for a decade. But a different sort of frost had settled into the air. Trust, once the unspoken currency of Britain's intelligence community, was now rationed like wartime sugar. Everyone eyed everyone else just a little too long. Philby thrived in this new climate. That still amazes me. Where others stumbled over their own anxiety, he walked calmly, shoulders squared, eyes steady. He even found himself posted to Washington again. This time as the official liaison between MI6 and the CIA. Imagine it. After Burgess and McLean's spectacular defection, after whispers that he had been the one to tip them off, he was still welcomed in the heart of American intelligence. The Americans were polite, but not warm. Men like James Angleton of the CIA, a brilliant and paranoid mind, developed an almost obsessive fascination with Philby. Equal parts trust and suspicion. Angleton and Philby would meet over drinks, exchanging insights on Soviet movements. But behind the cordial smiles there was a tightening coil of doubt. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the hunt for the third man was intensifying. MI5 officers sifted through old records, re-interviewed long-forgotten witnesses, scrutinized travel logs and expense reports. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was stacking up in a pattern that pointed, again and again, toward Philby. It's here, I think, that the genius of his survival became almost artistic. He knew how to use the peculiar British aversion to public scandal. Expelling Philby outright would have meant admitting that British intelligence had been deeply penetrated by Moscow for years. It would have meant embarrassment on a global stage. And embarrassment, in some circles, is treated as a greater crime than treason. So Philby remained. He kept working, kept drinking with colleagues, kept telling charming little stories about the old days in the Middle East. He was even summoned before a secret tribunal, questioned at length, and walked out cleared of all charges. Cleared. Not because they believed him, but because they feared the truth. I sometimes think about the cost of such choices. To protect the institution, they sacrificed the truth. And by doing so, they allowed the wound to deepen. How many more agents died because Philby was left in place? How many operations collapsed before they began? The questions have no answers, but they hang in the air like the ghost of unspoken guilt. Outside the intelligence world, the Cold War was sliding into one of its most dangerous phases. The Korean War had ended in stalemate, but the arms race was accelerating. The Soviet Union had tested the hydrogen bomb, and in London, the government was beginning to build its own nuclear deterrent. Philby, of course, passed every detail he could to his handlers in Moscow. One of the cruelest ironies is that while Philby was betraying his country at the highest levels, he was also betraying his own family. His second wife, Eleanor, had struggled for years with depression, worsened by her suspicion, never fully voiced, that her husband was not what he seemed. In 1957, she died suddenly, officially from influenza and heart failure. Friends whispered that the truth was darker, that the weight of her loneliness and confusion had simply crushed her. Philby, characteristically, moved them with alarming speed. I remember sitting alone in my own kitchen the night I first read about Eleanor's death. The detail that struck me wasn't the cause or the scandal. It was that she had died quietly, without him there. That kind of ending has a peculiar cruelty. You can share a home, a table, even a bed, and yet die as though you were a stranger to the person you loved. I've known that distance, though not to her extreme, and it leaves a chill that no fire seems to warm. Back in Washington, Philby's veneer began to crack. Small inconsistencies in his stories appeared. American counterintelligence started keeping a sharper eye. And yet, even then, he seemed untouchable. A master at retreating without looking like he was retreating. It would take one final slip, one crack in the mask, for the truth to finally pull him under. But that, my dears, was still a few years away. For now, Philby was still raising glasses at embassy dinners, still smiling his careful smile, still the man everyone wanted to believe was on their side. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. In some way, he always was. Just not on the side they thought. It was 1961 when the tide finally began to turn against Kim Philby. By then, the Cold War had entered a sharper, more dangerous edge. The Berlin Wall was rising. Cuba was simmering. And the paranoia that had been an undercurrent for years was now breaking the surface in every conversation. In intelligence circles, the hunt for the third man had become an obsession. The Americans were no longer content to keep doubts behind closed doors. New evidence, gleaned from defectors like Anatoly Golitsyn, pointed squarely at Philby. Golitsyn didn't just offer vague suspicions. He provided dates, names, patterns of betrayal that fit Philby's career like a tailored suit. Washington pressed London for action. And this time, the pressure couldn't be brushed aside. MI6 summoned Philby to London under the pretense of an informal debrief. But when he stepped into that dim, wood-paneled room on Broadway, it was no friendly chat. Nicholas Elliott, his old friend and fellow officer, sat across from him. A friend who, until that moment, had defended him fiercely. Elliott's voice was steady, but his eyes carried the weight of betrayal. They spoke for hours. Elliot laid out the evidence. Operations compromised. Agents dead. Timelines that matched too perfectly to be coincidence. Philby didn't rage or protest. Instead, he listened quietly. Even smiled faintly, as though acknowledging a well-played chess move. When Elliot finally asked him outright if he had been working for the Soviets, Philby gave no confession. No denial. Only a silence so heavy it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Still, in that peculiar British way, there was no immediate arrest. No handcuffs. They allowed him to return to Beirut, where he had been stationed as a journalist with The Observer and The Economist. Officially, he was no longer employed by MI6. Unofficially, the surveillance was constant. I've often thought about that choice. Was it caution? Bureaucratic inertia? Or some lingering reluctance to expose a man who had once been one of their own? In another life, I might have believed it was mercy. But in the cold mathematics of espionage, mercy often comes at the expense of justice. In Beirut, Philby lived as though nothing had changed. He hosted cocktail parties on his balcony, watched the Mediterranean shimmer under the sun, and continued, quietly, to pass information to the KGB. Friends noticed he drank more heavily now, the confident charm giving way to a certain restless edge. Perhaps he knew the walls were closing in. The break came in early 1963. A Soviet contact in Beirut, sensing the net tightening, arranged his escape. One night, Philby vanished from the city without a word to anyone. Not even to his third wife, Eleanor, who awoke to find him gone. He slipped aboard a Soviet freighter bound for Odessa, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills, unanswered questions, and shattered trust. London was left humiliated. The man they had protected, defended, and even cleared twice had walked straight into the arms of Moscow, confirming every suspicion they had been too cautious, or too proud, to act on. When the news broke, it was like a cold wind through the halls of Whitehall. Newspapers splashed his name across headlines. Television commentators spoke of betrayal in tones usually reserved for war. And ordinary Britons wondered how a man could live among them for decades while working for the enemy. And yet, in Moscow, Philby was welcomed as a hero. They gave him an apartment, an income, and the Order of the Red Banner. He was, in the Soviet narrative, the great British defector, the man who had humiliated the West. But even there, among his comrades, Philby was an outsider. His Russian never became fluent. He missed London's streets, English books, and the peculiar comfort of understatement. I sometimes imagine him in that Moscow apartment on a winter's night, glass in hand, listening to the snow fall against the window. Did he ever think of Elliot's face in that London interrogation room? Did he think of Aileen? Or of Eleanor, left in Beirut without so much as a note? Betrayal has a way of circling back, even on those who deal it. The Soviets trusted him, but never entirely. His usefulness diminished with time. And in the end, he was a man without a true home. Honored in Moscow, hated in London, and known everywhere as a traitor. For me, that's the quiet tragedy buried inside the louder scandal. The man who outplayed everyone in the game of loyalty and deception ended up exactly where such a life always leads. Surrounded, yet utterly alone. Philby's final years in Moscow were a strange blend of ceremony and quiet decline. In public, he was still paraded at certain events. a living emblem of Soviet cunning. A cautionary tale to the West. There would be photographs of him standing stiffly beside senior KGB officers, wearing medals that gleamed under the flashbulbs. Yet those who saw him up close noticed something else. The medals might have shone, but the man beneath them had dulled. By the 1970s, he had remarried. His fourth wife, Rufina Pukova, was a loyal companion who seemed determined to make his exile bearable. She brought warmth into their small Moscow apartment, cooked him English-style breakfasts, and tried to ease the ache of his disconnection. But there were nights, she later said, when she would find him staring silently into his glass, lost in thoughts she could never reach. Philby spent his days writing memoirs, offering lectures to KGB recruits, and occasionally entertaining foreign guests. Visiting journalists or carefully vetted dignitaries curious to see the infamous spy in the flesh. He spoke with charm, even wit, but never with full candor. The truth, after all, had always been his most closely guarded possession. And then there was the drinking. It had always been part of his social world. Wine at dinner, whiskey after. But in Moscow, the drink became more than a habit. It became a companion, a sedative, and perhaps a shield. Friends noted that the once razor-sharp mind sometimes drifted. His legendary self-control softened into something less disciplined, less certain. I remember reading an interview with Rufina years later. She insisted that Philby never once expressed regret for what he'd done. But regret is a slippery thing. It doesn't always arrive in the form of confession. Sometimes it hides in the pauses between words, or in the way a man lingers too long over a faded photograph. For me, the most telling moment of his later life wasn't in an official statement or a political gesture. It was an offhand remark he made to a friend. Looking out at the Moscow winter, he said, "It's the wrong kind of snow." A simple thing, almost meaningless, unless you knew what he meant. The snow here was dry and powdery. Nothing like the heavy, wet snow of London streets that clung to your boots and muffled the sound of the city. Even after decades, he was still measuring the world against a home he had abandoned. When he died in 1988, the Soviets gave him a hero's funeral. Red flags, solemn speeches, a grave in Moscow's Konchevo cemetery. The West noted his passing with a mixture of fascination and bitterness. In Britain, some called for his name to be erased from history, while others, curiously, couldn't help but acknowledge the audacity of his life. And what do I think? I think Philby's story is both a triumph and a tragedy, depending on where you choose to stand. To the Soviets, he was the perfect agent. To the British, the perfect traitor. To himself, perhaps, just a man who picked a side early on and refused to let go, no matter the cost. That's the thing about history. It rarely gives us clean heroes or villains. We like to think it does. But when you look closer, the lines blur. Philby wasn't just a spy. He was also a husband, a friend, a man who laughed at dinner tables and walked home under quiet streetlights. And yet, every step he took was shaped by a choice he made decades earlier. At a dinner party where ideas and wine flowed freely, and where the future seemed like a game he could win. And now, as I sit here in my little kitchen, the winter pressing its cold fingers against the window, I think about how betrayal can be both an action and a place. It's not just what you do. It's where you end up. For Philby, that place was Moscow, a city that could never truly be home. History remembers the noise, the headlines, the scandals, the grand gestures. But I wonder if, in the quiet moments before sleep, he remembered the other things. The familiar smell of rain on London pavements. The sound of old friends' laughter. The feel of a city that had once been his. And maybe, just maybe, that was the true cost of the game he chose to play. And so, dear listeners, as the snow outside begins to soften the edges of the night, we leave Kim Philby in his final resting place. A man whose life was defined by shadows and shifting loyalties. His story reminds us that history is not made only of battles and treaties, but of choices. Small at first, then larger, until they shape the whole of a life.